the topic that I'm looking at tonight is one that some of you here in the audience will know is dear to my heart, a very important site, one of the most important sites actually in the Near East, and I know Ross Burns will appreciate that, the site of Dura Europos. And so we're going to have a look particularly at some of the military hoards and a couple in particular that we'll get onto around some work that I've been doing now for a while, and that will continue on, I think, now for some time. So let's get underway. The map here gives you an indication, of course, where Dura Europos is for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So the excavations in the 1930s at Dura Europos on the Euphrates River in Syria were among the most significant undertaken in the ancient Near East in the 20th century. And some of the discoveries made news headlines around the world at the time in the 1930s. And our understanding of military, religious, civic, and cultural life in Syria and Mesopotamia in the Hellenistic, Parthian, and Roman periods has been advanced considerably due to work undertaken at the site. The city was founded as Europos in the early Seleucid period and came under Parthian control by around about 100 BC. And at some stage in the Parthian period, it also became known as Dura, a Semitic term meaning fort or fortress, thus the name it is known by to us, and that is as Dura Europos. It was briefly captured by the forces of Trajan around 116, before coming under permanent Roman control in the mid-160s. And it was then captured by the Sasanians in their momentous invasions of the mid-3rd century and abandoned soon after. And the Romans didn't reoccupy it. And in the middle of the 4th century, Ammianus Marcellinus, who was marching with Julian's army in 363, passed the city and described it as long abandoned. So we know that it was captured by the Sasanians, not reoccupied by the Romans, not kept by the Sasanians, not reoccupied by the Romans, and then essentially abandoned. And that's one of the reasons why it survived in the way that it did. Now, this is a photograph from the Yale University collection that shows what the excavations looked like by the time we got to the 1930s. There'd been some brief excavations done there in the early 20s and under the direction of Franz Cumont. We'll see a photo of him in a minute. But it was really in the late 1920s and 1930s that the excavations, to a certain extent, you might put excavations in inverted commas here, got underway, and they were quite they were unearthing all sorts of important material that was not only important to the site here, but also to the broader history of the Middle Euphrates and perhaps even more broadly in terms of Syria as well. This gives you a bit of a rundown of the excavation seasons. And as I said, there were 10 of them running from the late 20s through to 1937 under the direction of Michael Rostovtsev. And you can see Rostovtsev here with Franz Cumont, this famous photograph taken in front of the dual Tauroctones, which were part of the Mithraeum, which of course was the reason Cumont went out to the site again in his mid-70s to view the Mithraeum at Dura, because Mithraic studies was his great interest. There's then also a long series of excavations and a lot of remediation work done by Pierre Lariche up to 2011, just before the tragic circumstances of the war in Syria broke out. So it was a very well published site, and that's one of the great advantages of it. The Yale publications are quite significant. And they published a series of preliminary reports and then final reports up into the 1950s and 60s. And Cumont published quite a lot, and then Lariche has as well. So the site has been severely damaged, as we probably know, as a result of the war in Syria, but the publications that came out of the excavations were significant. Now, one of the things to bear in mind, one of the reasons why the material that we have from Dura survived as well as it did, was partly as a result of the Roman defense of the town. Now, you can see here in this image here taken from Simon James's article, his American Journal of Archaeology article, published now a bit over 10 years ago. He provides a good schema here of what happened in terms of the Roman defense of the city when the Sasanians attacked in the mid-250s. And essentially what they did was to take control of the buildings that were up against the rampart pathway, and to essentially, really from both inside and out, bury the walls and towers, to stop mining activity, but also to try and limit siege machinery from outside. It was particularly designed to stop or to limit mining activity. But as a consequence of taking control of these buildings here and levelling them to a certain extent as they did, these buildings, particularly on the western walls, but also on their northern and southern walls, preserved some quite remarkable material. You can see from this image here that I took at the site. This is the interior here, and you can see it's all obviously been excavated out, but it was here on this western wall in particular, but also on the northern wall, as a result of this activity, that some really important discoveries were made, and that the preservation was allowed that we otherwise might not have in a site that had ongoing occupation. You can see here from this map some of the important elements of the site in terms of what we'll be interested from the Roman period, particularly this quarter here, the northern quarter that comprised the Roman army camp from the early part of the 3rd century. There's also evidence of the siege mines at Tower 19 and Tower 14, which we'll have a little bit of a look at in a minute because they're relevant to what we're looking at. Also, the Temple of Artemis here, more in the central part of the city. But some other really important discoveries, not so significant to what we're looking at tonight, but ones that really were the ones hitting the headlines, like the synagogue, but also the Christian house, and the paintings that came from this Palmyrean temple in the northwest corner of the town. As I mentioned, there was also the Mithraeum that, of course, took the interest, especially of somebody like Cumont. The synagogue, many of you have probably already seen images of the synagogue as it's been reconstructed here in the National Museum in Damascus, was an absolute as I say, it made headlines in some newspapers around the world because it was such an extraordinary discovery here in the 1930s. The paintings of the Palmyrean temple, the Temple of the Palmyrean gods, it was known, were actually what were an indication in the early 1920s, or in 1920 actually, that this was a very important site. But one of the things to pay particular attention to, and that, as I say, is relevant to what we look at in terms of the hoard evidence, was the evidence for the siege of the city that the Sasanians conducted in the mid-250s. And it was particularly, as I showed at that earlier map, directed at Tower 14 and at Tower 19. And you can see here the mining activity coming in from the South Wadi, hollowing out underneath the entire tower here, the southwest tower of Tower 14, and part of the curtain and foundations, but also this siege ramp. And you can see the mining activity that's also taken place underneath it as part of trying to gain entry to the city. There was also a lot of counter mining activity from the Roman side, which is, of course, exactly what we would expect. You can see here the remains of the assault ramp still evident at the site, and this photograph taken again by the Dura, the Yale team in the 1930s, showing the ramp, and you can see the cross sections, the trenches that they dug through the ramp as part of their investigations of that. We then have at Tower 19, which is going to be particularly relevant to what we're looking at, a mine dug in from the desert to hollow out the northwest corner of Tower 19 and part of the wall. But then this mining activity here, which is at least in part counter mining coming in from the Roman side to try and take control of this mining activity and to limit it. In that particular tower, in what has been what came to be known as Tower 19, based on Yale's numbering of the towers, is where some of the most dramatic evidence came, and it's where some of our coin evidence comes from. And you can see here the effect of the firing of the mine, which has brought down part of the corner of the northwest corner of Tower 19, but also to here, this section here is an enlarged section of this section here. And we have all this counter mining activity where soldiers coming from the Roman side have come in to try and take control of the mine. And in the process, there's been some sort of subterranean battle take place. And it resulted in this considerable body scatter here. And this is actually a contemporary drawing from the 1930s. There's an updated version of this that's been done that I'll show you in a minute. And it's from here that some of the very latest coins from the site came, and what came not to be classified as a hoard, but in some ways treated as a hoard. And you can see here the drawing of what has shown to be a Persian soldier, and his helmet and sword not far away, also discovered as part of this subterranean activity. You can see or mining activity that's seen this underground battle take place. And you can see here from photographs at the time the type of mining activity that we're talking about. This image here is particularly important. It's one of the very few that were taken showing the mines from Tower 19 going underneath the interior embankment. And then the evidence, of course, for the Persian soldier. And the reason he's identified as Persian is partly based on the sword, which has a jade pommel, and it's identified as a Central Asian, probably having a Central Asian origin, and that the helmet is very much the style of the Sasanian Persians at the time. And this had a full, thorough reinvestigation by Simon James, the great expert of the arms and armour at Dura, who's only just recently retired from University of Leicester. Now, these were the then images that Yale supplied, and some published. This one published, this one not. The only images that were taken at the time of this individual identified as a Persian soldier from this section of the mine. And as I said, it's actually in that mine that we have this very important collection of coins that we'll talk about in a minute. Now, in relation to the coins, of course, and there were many different categories of evidence discovered at the site, the coins were perhaps the most prolific, and they were the subject of study at the time and since by some of the leading numismatists. And this included Alfred Bellinger, who published the final report here you can see the cover of. And now some of these coin finds became important in the development of a broader understanding of mint production and coin circulation in Roman Syria and Mesopotamia, especially in the 3rd century CE. And in fact, some of these conclusions are still very significant today to our understanding of, particularly of provincial mint production in the 220s and 230s. And of the 14,017 coins recovered in the excavations that were then published in the final report, and there would have been many more than that, but these are the numbers that are published. 6,798 were found in a total of 22 identified hoards, all but one of those hoards dating to the Roman period. Now, reconsideration of the original assumptions about the hoards from Dura has the potential to improve their usefulness as historical evidence. And 2 of the hoards, which were found with burials, one not strictly a hoard, but I'm speaking of it as a hoard, received special attention in this paper and provide a rare snapshot of coins that were carried by individuals for daily use at the time of their burial. And that's the critically important thing to note here. Now, 22 hoards from Dura were numbered based on the chronology of their discovery as the excavations progressed in the 1920s and 30s. And the collection and deposition of Hoard 17 differed markedly from the other hoards because it was a group of 45 Antoniniani found on the body of an individual, likely a soldier, buried in the embankment built against the west wall of the city as protection from the Sasanian siege of the mid-250s. And you've got images here. The only 2 images I'm aware of, actually, of this body buried in the fill. Now, another group of coins, numbering 82 in total, was found with the bodies of individuals who were buried in the collapsed siege mines under the walls and embankments adjacent to Tower 19 that we've just looked at. Now, as I've said, this group of coins wasn't classified as a hoard, but it received a separate description in the final report at the end of the section on the hoard. So it was kind of being treated as a hoard, and we can perhaps think of it as a hoard in some ways, although there are ways in which that could be a little misleading. Now, this body pile that I talked about before and showed you in relation to Tower 19, this is an updated drawing to the left from James's amazingly important article, Stratagems, Combats and Chemical Warfare at Dura. It was amongst this body scatter, and he's produced a much clearer a drawing than was done at the time of the 1930s, but it was in amongst this body scatter and bone scatter that a whole series of coins and collection of coins was found. Among those and among the coins found on the body buried in the embankment, we have the very latest coins of Dura. Now, in terms of composition, only hoard 13 predated the Roman period, and it was a collection of 207 bronze pieces, of which 206 were minted in the reign of Antiochus III. And then, of course, we have one, amazingly, being a Parthian dram dating to 40 years later. So we'll talk about some of these outliers in a minute. Of the remaining hoards, which all belong to the Roman period based on their contents, hoards 1 to 7, 11, 17, and 19 to 21 were composed exclusively of silver units. Some comprised only of Antoniniani or only of tetradrachms. Others containing a mixture of Antoniniani, tetradrachms, and denarii. Hoards 8, 9, 12, 14 to 16, and 22 were composed exclusively of bronze or copper alloy units. So imperial Gipondi, asses, and sturdy, together with some bronze units of the Eastern Provincial Mint. And hoards 10 and 18 were strictly mixed, but they were really virtually entirely silver. Only 1 or 2 pieces of bronze or copper with them. Now, typically, but not always, ownership of hoards comprised of silver were attributed to the military, while bronze copper alloy coins were believed to have been owned by shopkeepers, townsfolk, and even an errant tax collector. Now, coin hoards and dating the capture of the city has been one of the really key scholarly interests. Now, there was a lot of debate about this that emerged in the 1930s when the coins and the hoards were coming up in a serious way. Up to that point, a lot of it in the early 1920s had really only just been surface ones, but there were a lot of excavation coins coming up, and the hoards increasingly discovered in the 1930s led to a lot of debate over the dating of the fall of the city. That's really occupied, it's been the principal scholarly focus in the coins from Dura since the publication of the final report in 1949. There's been ongoing debate about this, and an ongoing debate about whether the city actually fell once or twice, and there's a lot to go into with that, but it's not the place to do that here. Some features of the hoards, now, and what I would actually say before going on to the next part is that this focus on the dating of the fall of the city using the coins has tended to obscure other things that we might do with them, and particularly the way that we might use the hoards. Now, some features of the hoards are really worth paying attention to as potential indicators of more complex factors in relation to the practice of hoarding coins than was originally suggested by Bellinger, and which have had no scholarly focus since. Now, some of the hoards contained what appeared to Bellinger and others at the time as outliers. So single examples of coins datable to sometimes much later periods than the bulk of the coins in those hoards. And this caused problems for the numismatists at the time and others since in dating their deposition, but especially in explaining their composition. And it often led to some fanciful, and I have to say, some cases some quite quaint conclusions. Now, hoard 5, for example, was a small hoard of 29 silver units, comprised entirely of tetradrachms, so provincial tetradrachms, and denarii of the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, except for one Antoninianus of Valerian from Antioch, dated to the mid-250s. So it's clearly a quite significant outlier. The inclusion of this last coin was described by Bellinger, and I quote here, as a preposterous addition to an otherwise reasonable group, and that because it was found with the remains of a Hessian purse, quoting again, "It is not unduly imaginative to suppose that during the sack of the city, the owner took the little family treasure, added to it the single silver piece that he had about him, and lost the whole lot in his flight." And these were some of the conclusions that were being drawn at the time. And they were made about the depositions of other hoards. And we have hoard 7 here, which was comprised of 358 silver units, including denarii, tetradrachms, and antoniniani. And all of the coins dated to 249 or earlier, except again for one Antoninianus of the reign of Trebonianus Gallus, and it dated to 253. Bellinger's explanation, once again, was that the depositor of the hoard placed a coin in it that he happened to have about him before the hoard was buried. And in relation to hoard 13, which I referred to briefly before as the only hoard not dated to the Roman period, the inclusion of an especially unusual outlier, the bronze unit of Mithridates I of Parthia, which dated to 38 years later than the other 207 pieces of the Seleucid period, drew the conclusion that the Seleucid bronzes were still in circulation at Dura in the Parthian period, and that I'm sure there's probably something in that. And that when they were buried, once again, the owner of the hoard added a coin that he happened to have about him. This is the only way they could explain it. And I love this this explanation of Bellinger's as to what this hoard might actually be about, because he observed further in relation to the hoard that Nicholas Toll, who was another one of the excavators at the site, suggests to me the pleasant fancy that we may have in this hoard the peculation of a minor official engaged in collecting some fixed trifling tax, who found the means of putting in his own pocket a part of the proceeds. And get this would account for the uniformity of the contents, and no one familiar with the Near East would deny that such an explanation is possible. At least we can be sure that the owner was not one of the substantial citizens of Seleucid Dura. So these were the types of conclusions that were being drawn about the hoards at the time. Bellinger, with Rostov concurring, assumed that the burial of the hoards by their owners came in response to military activity or civil unrest, at which point these individuals sought to secure their savings by burying them in concealed locations. And there's a certain sense that might have with us, perhaps. Using this methodology, the hoards containing the latest coins, dating to the mid-250s, could be easily linked to the Sasanian military activity that saw the city captured. But the deposition of other hoards was more difficult to explain, leading to tenuous suggestions or none at all. And hoard 21, which was a small hoard of denarii of the 1st and 2nd centuries, contained a coin of Commodus as its latest. But this was thought by Bellinger to have been buried during the wars following the emperor's assassination, right out here in eastern Syria. No known disturbance explained the burial of other hoards like 3 and 4. Now, while it's likely that some hoards were lost to their owners due to military conflict, is it necessarily the case that the principal reason for burying hoards was due to impending military activity? The burial of hoards was likely an option chosen by some to secure their collections on an ongoing basis, and the possibility of dislocation from their hoards increased during periods of military instability, thus explaining the number of hoards discovered at the site, whose latest coins dated to the 250s. Clearly, there are other possible explanations for an owner losing contact with a hoard, and these need not be military as well. Further to this, owners of hoards who chose buried hiding places for the purpose of ongoing security likely returned to their hoards on multiple occasions, making subtractions and additions to them over time, and perhaps this explains the presence of apparent outliers. On this interpretation, hoards were deposited in functional hiding places that served the purpose of security over time, and military activity involving Dura principally explains their loss rather than the original reason for their deposition. And that's the line that I'm taking. Now, in the analysis of the hoards, emphasis was placed on whether their ownership had a direct military connection. And this approach was clearly influenced by the role Dura played in military activity between Rome and Persia in the 3rd century and the nature of the military evidence that survived at the site. Bellinger identified hoards 1 and 10, for example, as hoards owned by soldiers, partly based on their content and partly on their find spots. The hoards were comprised of similar ratios of Antoniniani and tetradrachms, which Bellinger believed were the denominations in which soldiers were paid. The exclusion of denarii from these hoards was further evidence that they were military in ownership, because denarii were apparently not favoured by the soldiers following the introduction of the Antoninianus in the 3rd century and the associated phasing out of the denarius. The problem was that these hoards, which were partly identified as military on the basis of the exclusion of denarii, were the principal evidence for this suggestion, so there was a clear circularity here of argument. And preconceived ideas about which groups would or would not have used particular denominations of coins resulted in some nuanced observations and theories at the time of their analysis in the 1930s and 40s. Hoards 14 and 15, for example, were the only hoards found in the area of the Roman army camp, more specifically under a room thought to be part of the barracks, but their ownership by soldiers was dismissed because they were comprised entirely of bronze. The soldiers would apparently only have hoarded silver because they were paid in silver. The ownership, in turn, of hoards 3 and 4, which were comprised mostly of tetradrachms, some Antoniniani, was attributed to a priest because the find spot was under a house next to what was identified as a temple of Artemis and Atargatis. There was thus a lack of consistency in interpreting ownership of hoards, and there were preconceptions as to their ownership based on the types of metals they contained and or their find spots. Now, hoard 17 is perhaps the most remarkable hoard or grouping of coins discovered at the site. And the coins also found with the corpses under Tower 19 that I referred to before. These collections were especially rare examples of coins carried by individuals at the times of their deaths, and the circumstances by which these coins were selected prior to their deposition were different to those of the other hoards. Buried hoards were deliberately selected for burial, whether as savings or for some other purpose, whereas the two collections found on the bodies were carried by their owners, presumably for the purpose of being used presently or in the near future. The 45 coins in Hoard 17 date to the reigns of Trebonianus Gallus, and you can see here from this, this catalogue that I've put together of them, they dated to the reigns of Trebonianus Gallus and the joint reigns of Valerian and Gallienus up to 256, and all of them are Antoniniani, so they're quite a tight group. The preliminary report recorded 48 coins, but only 45 actually made it into the final catalogue, and I don't know why that's the case. But two of these coins became centrally important to the dating of the capture of the city by the Sasanians for the Romans, as they are considered to be two of the two latest coins found at the site. But with so much focus on the coins for the purposes of dating, less attention, if any, has been paid to their composition and what they might tell us about coins in circulation at the time. Now, this is the only, with the art gallery, Yale, in fact, the ownership of coins have all been transferred to the art gallery. Yale have undergone a quite significant digitization project now over many years, and they've been putting, well, they've now got, I think all the images that they've got to put up have been put up, and some of the coins have been put up, and I've gone through a process of trying to identify which ones we can categorically guarantee came from these two groups, either from Hoard 17 or from the corpses. There are a number that are available on the Yale website that I think we can probably safely attribute to these two groups, but I'm being pretty cautious here in being able to say these definitely came from these groups. Now, this is the only one I've been able to identify so far that came from the body discovered in the fill. This particular coin of Volusian dating to 251, 252. We then have the coins comprising the coins from the corpses. And you can see here from this list that I've put together as well, that it's a broader range. We've got some going back to as early as the reign of Gordian III, and up to Philip, and their Rome mints. You can see some from Decius, Herenio Etrusca, Trebonianus Gallus, mostly from the Antioch mint, but some from the second mint operating in Syria at the time, which was probably Samosata. And you can see the coins there of Valerian from Samosata being some of the very latest ones. Now, and you can see also too, particularly the reverse inscriptions and iconography the great variety that you can see of types here, which is very characteristic of the mid-3rd century. And I have some theories on that I've written about in other places as to why we get this considerable variation in reverse illustrations, in reverse iconography and inscriptions on the coins at the time in the mid-250s. Now, at the time of the excavations in the 1930s, it was claimed that bodies of as many as 16 to 18 individuals were found in the mines, but it's been noted more recently that the published drawings only really indicate approximately 10, and that's James's work. Simon James has pointed that out. The drawings also indicate that these coins were essentially scattered through the body pile. Now, it's hard to see in this image, but there is a key that indicates that the coins, the various locations that they were found here, scattered through the body pile and the other debris. And Bellinger actually remarked at the time on the poor state of these coins and said most of them were in a deplorable state of corrosion, that they didn't seem worth casting. And that was probably as a result of them not being stored in a container, even a purse that would give some sort of protection that we find with the deliberately buried hoards and with the hoard, with hoard 17 on the body. But it's interesting to note here that actually, despite Bellinger's observation, at least 8 were cast and illustrated in the final report, compared with only 1 so far that I can find from hoard 17. Now, if we just go back to the catalogue, the coins of Volusian and Trebanianus Gallus depict military themes on their reverses, with those of Gallus likely minted in preparation for the war with Persia at the time of Sharpel I's invasion of 252-3. And of the coins of Valerian and Gallienus, among the coins found with the corpses, 23 of 40 were attributed to them at Samosata, while 15 originated in Antioch and 2 in Rome. And as noted earlier, the operation of a second mint in the East under Valerian and Gallienus has been widely debated, but it's probably Samosata. Many of the coins discovered at Dura were transferred to Yale University in the 1930s and 40s and are now held at the art gallery, as I mentioned before. Now, due to the nature of the publication of the final report on the coins and the select illustration in cast form of only some of them in the catalogue that formed the final report, it's only possible to presently identify images, as I said, of a few of them. Now, there are others that I've been able to identify from this particular group of the coins with the corpses. And what really is sort of notable here is the condition of some of these coins, the uncirculated condition of some of them. This one here, this Antoninianus of Trebanianus Gallus, is a good example of just of how the condition of these coins, despite what Bellinger said, actually some of them survived remarkably and are in very good condition. So it shows that they'd only been very recently minted and not circulated, or not circulated much at all at the time of their burial, which shows that the soldiers who were carrying them had probably not been carrying them for that long. At the time, the idea was that these were sort of their last pay packets, and we can't really know that. But they are at least an indication of the types of coins that soldiers were carrying on them at the time, more for daily use, we would expect. Now, the circumstances of the burial of both groups, of Hoard 17 and of the coins in the mine, indicate they were likely deposited in the context of the final siege and capture of the city. And before we go on to that, here are a couple of others to look at. There's also this one of Valerian, again in very good condition, and then some others as well showing. I think some of these might be more due to weak striking, such as the obverse of this one, than due to wear. You can see the reverses here. This reverse is very strong. So is this obverse here of Valerian. So typically they're not really showing much of any sign really of wear. There are a number of observations worth emphasising in relation to both groups of coins, and some with the potential to provide new ways of thinking about them as evidence for events during this period. The circumstances of the burial of both groups indicate they were likely deposited in the context of the final siege and capture of the city. And the suggestion at the time of their excavation was that the soldier buried in the wall fill and those buried in the collapsed mine were part of a relief force sent to defend the city. In both cases, the hoards were comprised entirely of Antoniniani. And in the case of Hoard 17, the chronology of the minting of those coins was narrower than that of the coins of the corpses, which we saw before. Most of them minted under Valerian and Gallienus, the few under Gallus. The coins with the corpses were comprised of a considerable portion from the reigns of Valerian and Gallienus, but some went back to as early as the reign of Gordian III. And the cessation of minting tetradrams under Trebonianus Gallus in or by 253 likely explains their absence in both hoards, and potentially indicates there was a preference by soldiers to avoid tetradrams post 253, even though they were still in circulation. The variety of reverse types evident in both groups of coins is another feature worth expanding on. Reduced levels of fineness contributing to the debasement of imperial silver currencies is a well-known feature of Roman coinage as the 3rd century progressed. The phasing out of the denarius by the reign of Gordian III in favour of the Antoninianus contributed further to this debasement, and silver content of the Antoninianus dropped precipitously in the 250s. By the sole reign of Gallienus, 260 to 268, the proportion of silver in the Antoninianus dropped to the point that it was confined to the silver wash coated over a base metal copper alloy coin. Now, when precious metal content is reduced by such levels in commodity currencies, there is an increasing risk of a loss of faith in that currency. And with the Antoninianus as the principal means by which soldiers were paid, a point confirmed by the 2 collections found with bodies at Dura, there were clear and inherent potential dangers to imperial authorities. And in an attempt to maintain faith in the currency, an increased range of messaging claiming restoration and security of the state, military strength, and the blessing of the gods is noticeable in the 250s, especially in the joint reigns of Valerian and Gallienus. And the range of reverses on Antoniniani of this period is demonstrated in the coins of Hoard 17 and those found with corpses, which were coins carried on the persons of those fighting to save Dura from some sort of Persian attack. Now, in conclusion, it's important to appreciate that the analysis of the coin hoards from Dura was published in a timely manner in the 1930s and 40s, and it was undertaken by some of the leading numismatists, archaeologists, and historians of the time. It's easy, perhaps, to be critical with nearly a century of hindsight and with access to a considerably larger corpus of secondary study and analysis undertaken since the time of excavations. At the same time, there were obvious shortcomings, preoccupations, and problems with the original numismatic and historical analysis. Strong focus on attempting to date the Sasanian capture or captures of Dura using the numismatic evidence, particularly the hoards, has obscured other historical analysis that might be made using the hoards. Now, further work really needs to be done on the hoards from Dura using the physical evidence currently held by Yale. The nature of record keeping in the 1940s and later will make that a challenging endeavour, but one that will likely pay dividends, I think. The provision of a catalogue of the hoards found in the context of highly unusual burials at Dura, which provides reference to the latest standard numismatic works, together with new historical observations using these unusual hoards as evidence, is really only a starting point. Thank you.